I like this. Diana has all the power, but I get to sit in the big chair. That's how it seems to work. It's a bit like going to Parliament. Diana gets this summons from the Queen, which says, because of diverse problems in church and state, you are required to attend at Westminster. I have to fight an election. A great deal of effort had to go into it this time, but Diana did a lot of that too. And we had a very fierce contest in my constituency, as you will have seen. But the first thought you should take away with you today is that you have actually changed politics, which some of us have been trying to do for, 37 years, in my case at Westminster, and longer outside it, and many of you for many years. And you have actually changed politics, particularly by ensuring that the North East has at least 2 members of Parliament, making up Liberal Democrat numbers at Westminster. And without those Liberal Democrat numbers and the balance between the other parties, the opportunity to create a coalition government wouldn't have arisen, the need to do so wouldn't have arisen, and some pretty dramatic political change wouldn't have taken place. And the first and most obvious thing it's actually done is shown that coalitions are possible, and the sky does not fall in. The Liberal Ad Pact was a bit like that. 2 parties working together in government, and the media immediately thought that the world was going to come to a very rapid end. Well, we've actually started to demonstrate that you can create a coalition government and it can work. Now, it was not without preparation of various kinds. Our side was well prepared, and that's why we were able to field such a very effective negotiating team who achieved such a remarkable agreement. But as chairman of the Justice Committee, to which I've just been re-elected, I made sure that the Cabinet Office was prepared. We had the Cabinet Secretary in, we had 2 previous Cabinet Secretaries and various constitutional experts at a session which was televised. And if you ever watched the Parliament channel, it kept being repeated, particularly as we got closer to the election. And that helped to lay down clear rules of how the negotiations would be conducted and of the need for some time. We were particularly concerned that there would be enormous media pressure that by Friday night after the election we should have decided what the government would be, because that's the way it's always been. And we were determined that that would not be the case. And the preparations we made helped to ensure that that was so. And contrary to predictions, the markets did not go crazy. There's plenty else to think about in Greece anyway, which was quite a help. And we had an orderly process. And it enabled us, of course, to conduct the negotiations that we had with the Labour Party as well, which were pretty important to understanding. Not only was there an arithmetical problem about a coalition with Labour, a very, very real arithmetical problem, but Labour hadn't got the will to live anyway. They actually, most of them wanted to go into opposition and fight the leadership election, which they're now fighting, on which the best comment was, I think, made by Diane Abbott when she became candidate about the Miliband's, that their mother should have sorted it out. Now, I'm serious in saying that you have changed politics. I know it happens in funny practical ways. We had 1 or 2 problems with seating. Diana might tell you later they've got far more difficult problems in the Lords with seating because they've got bishops to contend with there, who've been sitting in the same seats for 500 years. We had a slight problem that because there were basically so many Tories, many of them new, trying to find somewhere to sit and not knowing where they were supposed to go, they kept popping up on our bench in the first couple of days, taking seats that we actually needed. And it was quite instructive when I just popped back into our whip's office and told them this was happening, and a whip suddenly appears and just moves them. Moves a bunch of Tory MPs. Happened again the next day, I did it again, and a pager message, obviously, while they all got their pagers out, or their Blackberries, and started looking at, and they all got up and moved. Strange ways that it's actually working in practical effects. Now, it has problems for the media, which were beautifully summed up in a piece that some of you may have seen in the Independent on about Wednesday or Thursday, of which the headline was, "Coalition Working, Where's the Story in That?" And just think about it for a moment. That is the media's big problem. And the article went on to analyse, taking the Scottish experience where exactly this happened, the difficulty the media have in understanding that a coalition government is what we have got, and therefore, as you normally do, you look at what sort of policies it's pursuing, whether you think they're policies that are going to work, whether there are tensions around those policies, but it's not an issue of whether the coalition will still be there next week or the week after. It will. And that's exactly what happened in Scotland. For nearly 2 years, actually, the Scottish media could not get their heads around the fact that the government was a coalition, it was going to stay a coalition for the duration of the Parliament, and there would be arguments about policy, but the coalition was there to stay. And it'll take them a while to grasp that point in the United Kingdom Parliament as well. Well, how is it working? Well, there are various points that have come up in the course of the earlier sessions from which you have gleaned some things. One of the things I would say that we regard as very important is that our ministers are closely integrated in the parliamentary party. It was very instructive when David Cameron had that row with the 1922 committee about what their ministers should do. There was a tremendous reaction from Tory backbenchers at the idea that ministers were going to come along to their backbench meeting and even perhaps vote in elections within the parliamentary party. Our view was and is precisely the opposite of that. We made it a three-line whip from day one that all our ministers, cabinet ministers, junior ministers, must attend the parliamentary party every week. And the level of apology required or permission required not to be there is the same level as a three-line whip vote. Because we took the view that this is not some distant government and we are the observing backbenchers. This is the Liberal Democrats as one integrated force, some of whom are engaged directly in government as Deputy Prime Minister, Cabinet Minister and junior ministers. And that's absolutely vital to us, so that at every parliamentary party meeting, every discussion we have on issues of policy is a discussion which ministers both take part in and hear. And I regard that as absolutely essential to the way we operate. Now, the central problem for us in all of this, in my view and I imagine yours, is maintaining identity while at the same time not destabilising the coalition. If I go back, as I do in memory, to the Lib Dem Pact, that was rather different. All we had then was an agreement to keep a government in power so long as it did certain things that we'd insisted on and consulted on any new policy developments. And we had a philosophy then which was actually put into phraseology by David Penhaligon. It was a row a month. The idea was you had to have a row a month to show that we were still there, we were still having an impact. But it was a different situation. We weren't actually part of the government. We weren't standing up in the House and explaining why the government was doing this, that or the other. We were simply supporting it from the other side on certain crucial issues. This is a very different situation. We don't actually want the coalition to look inherently unstable and feed the media's desire to make the public think that coalition is somehow a bad thing or an impossible thing to sustain over any period. Something foreign, which is where they love to describe it. It's what they do in other European countries. That's why Britain is so successful. And all other European countries are such an economic disaster. That's the Daily Mail version of events. Especially Greece. Oh, the Daily Mail hasn't quite noticed that Greece is run under our system, not the way the rest of Europe runs with a majority government. So we don't actually want a destabilised coalition, but we want to make people fully aware that we're there, that our influence is causing certain things not to be done, causing other things to be done, and causing things to be done in better ways than they might otherwise have been done. And that means we've got to keep reminding people what our message is. Now, a lot of that is local campaigning. It's messages we put out locally. Not messages designed to destabilise the coalition, but messages designed to show why we're there and what we're trying to do with it, and what we're trying to ensure through this coalition. But also, it places a burden on us as to how we play things in Parliament. And we've agreed that we need to have a visible parliamentary presence. So we will be creating teams in all the policy areas. There'll be people speaking on behalf of the parliamentary party. And the situation is slightly different where the minister is a Liberal Democrat from one where it isn't a Liberal Democrat. Chris Huhne at Energy, for example, it will be a slightly different situation than those departments like DEFRA, for example, where we don't have a minister. But we will have teams of members ensuring that we're staking out what is important to Liberal Democrats in debate. And we're seizing the procedural opportunities. In conjunction with the Chief Whip, with a few telephone calls to me on the train, we set up an arrangement on the very first day of debating, the very first day's debate on the Queen's speech. And this was the arrangement. In those debates where the government minister is a Conservative, what we will do is the Conservative minister will speak, the Labour opposition spokesman will speak, and then a Liberal Democrat will speak from the backbenches. And that's what I did on the first day of the debate. The reverse will happen if the Liberal Democrat minister opens the debate, and the Conservative will then get their chance to put in a Conservative word. But it's one of a number of ways in which, from the very beginning, we felt it important to stake out that we are still very much there as a distinctive political party, taking part in a coalition. And we're looking at how we can make good use of question time, Westminster Hall debates, and all the other processes to maintain identity within a stable coalition. And one of the good things, I would say, about most of the Conservative ministers in the coalition is that they seem to understand what the game is. They seem to understand that this is a coalition. And so they're not talking about a Conservative government, they're talking about a coalition government. And that people you might not have expected to do so are referring quite clearly to policies which are being pursued because Liberal Democrats, they were important to Liberal Democrats. And we don't need to make any secret of the fact that, for example, we were keen on raising the initial, the starting tax threshold, any more than the Conservatives need to make any secret of the fact that they had their own particular concerns about capital gains tax, and that we're having to marry these two different policies. And there is a degree of understanding which slightly surprised me among some of the Conservative ministers, that they've got to talk in those terms. And that I think has made it easier to operate. Now, Fiona was mentioning at the close of her remarks what we're going to try and do for our own region. And that's extremely important. I don't know if anyone's mentioned so far, but we are setting up. So, you know, all these speeches I made here, when I've said I don't want to be the only Liberal Democrat in the North East, I want to chair the North East Parliamentary Party. Well, I'm going to now. It's not just going to be me and Ian Swales. Wonderful combination, though, and I'm sure you'll all agree that will be, because it will actually be the party in both houses. So it will be Diana and John Shipley and Rupert Reedsdale, be the party in the Commons, myself and Ian, with Frank attending as regional chairman. And we've already fixed the first formal meeting that we're going to have, and we intend to operate as an effective and powerful group and a clear voice for the region. And I regard that as a quite central part of what we're doing at Westminster. We've got to make this coalition work for us as Liberal Democrats and the things we believe in, and for the region we represent. Now, we've had a number of very helpful statements from Vince Cable and from the Prime Minister as well about the particular needs of the North East, and that's very welcome. It's going to be quite a fight to get those turned into reality in a situation where certain things are happening as far as cuts are concerned. One is that some measures which are taken nationally may have a disproportionate impact in the North East, where you've got high level of public sector employment, high level of benefit dependency, so anything that happens nationally has an impact on the North East. Secondly, you've got a number of areas where what the government is saying, we're reviewing all the commitments that the previous government made in its last months in power, when frankly it was signing cheques as if there was no tomorrow. Some of them for quite worthy, very worthy things, but things we hadn't actually got the money for. And that review process initially, for example, affected Nissan, but the decision was taken quite quickly that the Nissan project must go ahead. And that was a very welcome decision. And I know that Vince, thanks to some of you here actually, and the fact that we got him up here, and while he was up here being very helpful to us electorally, we were making good use of the time to tell him what life is like here and what particular problems we have. He's certainly taken that on board very well indeed, and that's is being reflected in some of the things that are happening now. But it will mean you open your newspaper some days, you think, oh, I thought, we in the North East are going to be protected from all this. There's no way that the North East can be simply ring-fenced, if you like. Indeed, ring-fencing is rather a bad thing to do in general in these circumstances, because it stops you asking rational questions about where you should be spending the money to achieve the best effect. But there is a recognition that the North East has particular needs and that these have to be addressed. And one of the reasons for a team like the one I've described being important is to keep reminding government of key points on which that special consideration should take some particular form. And that's one of the things that we most certainly intend to do. So lots of things you've done have been valuable. making sure that we had a powerful Liberal Democrat presence in the region, making sure that we elected at least 2 Liberal Democrat members of Parliament, making sure that all the visitors we got during the election campaign understood more about the region when they left than they did when they arrived, more conspicuously in some cases than others. All of that has been extremely valuable. When I go to events around my constituency, I find a quite extraordinary change in the political atmosphere for the one which preceded the general election. The political atmosphere preceding the general election was as sour more sour than I have ever experienced in the whole of my life, and that was in a very significant extent around the expenses issue and the way the media had presented that issue, along with all the very specific disappointments that people had had about the Labour government. So the level of disillusionment with politics was very high. It's really quite surprising how many people now come up to me and say, this is all very interesting, this is really quite exciting, or I'm quite optimistic, and different things, but all of them suggesting that politics has suddenly become something that they care positively about again, rather than something they'd simply like to get rid of. I thought the atmosphere before the election was extremely dangerous. It was the kind of atmosphere in which fascism flourishes. It was the kind of atmosphere in which extremism grows. And if it had gone on for any length of time, it would have been a real problem. The change was partly helped, I believe, by Nick in the leadership election campaign. It's quite an extraordinarily good performance in the television debates. That didn't have the political effect we thought it would have and hoped that it would have. In fact, it had almost the opposite. It got a lot of people to come out and vote because the election had become interesting. But what did they do? They voted along tribal lines. There were people who didn't vote very often, and when they did, they voted the way they used to many years ago. And so you found in Labour constituencies more Labour voters turning out than Conservative, or constituencies where the Conservatives of the opposition, like mine, you found Conservatives turning out. But in another way, it began the process of rehabilitating democracy and rehabilitating politics. And I believe that the coalition is the continuation of that process.